Thank you for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. I want to acknowledge in the audience my father, Melvin Goldzbland, in the back there, and my friend Barry Carlton behind the camera. Thank the museum for this opportunity, and especially archivist Debbie Saracini, who twice dug out the boxes from the archives so I could do my research. My name is Dan Goldzbland, and I miss PSA every day. Allow me to present my academic credentials, which Katrina already outlined. But there's one more relevant credential I should present today. I am an AV geek. This is me in 2015 with the prototype 727 when she was still in storage up in Everett. Since then, she's been restored, flown to Seattle, and put on display at the Museum of Flight. I visited her there too, but you can't get as intimate there as we did. I'd like to say that my first love was not a woman, but the Boeing 707. She's the first girl I wanted to spend my life with. Well, I liked her younger sister too. This is what I want to talk about today. But before I do, let me say that I am not here to praise PSA, but to analyze it. And I'm not going to do this by talking about the planes, the operation, or even the length, or lack thereof, of the stewardess's skirts. I'm going to talk about why the airline ultimately failed as a commercial enterprise and what we can learn from that. I'm going to use marketing and organization theory and financial information to offer an answer to the first question and the marketing and organization theory to the second. I want to examine the big picture and along the way, perhaps teach a bit of accounting. Don't let that scare you. This is the first time I'm giving this presentation. It's her first flight. I'm very eager to hear your questions, suggestions, and even criticisms. We'll have time at the end for all of those, so please hold them until then, with one exception. If you need an immediate point of clarification, just shout it out. I'm very accustomed to that. And it will be welcome because if it's puzzling you, it's probably puzzling a few other people also, and we do not want to move forward with any confusion. My high school speech coach drilled me in the practice of audience analysis. So let me poll all of you to see who I'm talking to. What was your relationship to PSA? How many, if any, were employees? You have one there. Any vendors, including airport operations? Other service providers, ATCs, regulators, customers? Any corporate customers? Any unfortunates with no contact at all? My heart goes out to you. I'm not going to ask if anyone ever dated or married a stewardess or a pilot. And that's as far as I'm going into stereotypes this morning. Well, this is a financial question. So I will use financial information to formulate an answer. Let's begin by looking at PSA's financial performance, beginning with sales. How were PSA's revenues over its last 18 years? Can everybody see this clearly? Good. This is in dollars, not the total number of passengers. You can't deposit passengers in the bank or use them to pay your bills. So it's important to use monetary measures to answer financial questions. And I'm not going to put a bunch of numbers up on the screen. They make even my eyes glaze over. We'll stick with graphs, which are easier to absorb. Yeah, everybody get this one? By the way, you may be a bit surprised to see such a color in a graph, but I thought it'd be nice to honor PSA by using its own hot colors in the graphics, starting with the red. We'll disregard that color's traditional meaning in the world of accounting. As you can see, PSA's revenues rose continuously except for the year of the pilot strike when they were flat. And they grew very fast in its last couple of years. There was clearly opportunity ahead. Now, let me ask, does anybody know Shay Oakley over at the World Aviation Historical Society? Well, you ought to get to know him. He's a great guy. I read his LinkedIn posts all the time. I bounced my idea for this presentation off of him a few years ago, and he said that PSA's fortunes were linked to the population growth of California. When it stopped, he said, PSA faltered. Well, I don't think the data supports that. The passenger revenue line in red, of course, looks nothing like the graph you just saw, because this graph does not present dollars per year. Rather, it shows percent change versus the prior year. YOY at the top, by the way, means year over year or year versus prior year. And even though revenue growth did fluctuate, it grew meaningfully every year but one. At the same time, California's population grew steadily, about 2% a year. That's the orange line at the bottom of the graph. The blue line is the state's GDP, gross domestic product. And it also grew rather steadily, between 5 and 15% every year. And the trend of PSA's revenue growth does roughly correlate with the trend of state GDP growth in blue, although they did diverge at the very end there. It was in this economic environment that PSA was able to grow its revenues in 17 out of its final 18 years, as we saw in the previous slide. Focusing on the company's final 8 years, we see that passenger revenue growth remained strong and consistent after 1980, the 1 year that remained essentially unchanged. Again, due to the pilot strike, you can see that it's staying right there between 15 and 20% growth every year, except for the last full year, when it experienced the largest increase in revenues since that flat year of 1980. And remember, it's the red numbers on the left that correlate to the red line. We've got two different scales on the graph. Meanwhile, on the right, you can see California GDP. Sales are fine, but they're not what we mean by making money. That means profits, especially net income, the final measure of profits. Net income is the amount of profit that remains after all expenses for the year are deducted from the revenues. And here the picture is not so rosy. Fans of Top Gun will remember the command not to fall below the hard floor of 10,000 feet. I have highlighted in black the financial hard floor here, zero net income. Just as in Top Gun, you can violate this level without destroying yourself, but in the long run, it is not sustainable. On the other hand, it is not unusual in industry, especially the airline industry, to experience losing years before returning to profitability. PSA's last positive net income occurred 4 years before the airline was sold. Right there. But the rebound is evident. What a difference we can see between the trends of revenue in red and net income in magenta. Note that net income is on the left in magenta and revenue on the right in red. And those are passenger revenues. I'm not including all the other things that the company did because we're focused on the airline. At this point, the story gets more complicated. I'm not going to go into much detail, but let me add a few historic milestones that will provide some important context. The letters on these may be a little hard to read. I'll narrate them for you. So here is the oil shock and mechanics strike in 1973. J. Floyd Andrews' retirement, I believe it was 75. The San Diego crash in 78. The second oil shock shortly thereafter. The pilots' strike in 1980. And Bill Schimp's death in 1983. I'll be happy to make this presentation available to anyone who wants to study it at their leisure. Now that we've looked at PSA on its own terms, we need to compare it to other airlines. To do that, we need a new measure, one that is not distorted by the large differences in size between companies. After all, a much larger airline is likely to have much larger revenues and much larger profits. But is it really that much more successful? Well, the standard way to compare financial performance between companies is with earnings per share. That is net income divided by the number of shares of stock outstanding. Then you have equivalency between two companies. Sure, a larger one is going to have more net income, but it's also going to have more shares outstanding. So all things being equal, you get an equivalent comparison. Not surprisingly, PSA's earnings per share, or EPS, looks remarkably like the net income line. And here it is. I've added net income in the darker color, and we can even use the same vertical scale on the left. It's just that net income is in millions of dollars and earnings per share is in whole dollars. And they correlate quite well. And again, the rebound in earnings in 1986 is clearly evident. How did PSA's earnings per share compare to that of other airlines? That matters to investors who have a choice of which company's stock to buy. Here in PSA's final 4 years is how its EPS compared to other major airlines in the California market. Airline performance is historically volatile, and the companies have often turned in negative results. But in this case, PSA's results trailed its competitors in the pink below the hard floor. On the other hand, PSA's stock price, while a little lower than that of its competitor airlines, still moved quite consistently with them. It was positive, and that indicates a market outlook that is bullish on its future. Stock prices reflect the market's expectation of future rather than past performance. You don't think so? Just have a look at Pan Am's price at the bottom of the graph. So here we can summarize the pros and cons of selling the airline. It is admittedly a mixed bag. PSA had its difficulties, but I would not lump it in with the likes of Western and Pan Am. I contend there was future opportunity to be exploited. Which leads to question 2. Why didn't it get exploited? Specifically, from my point of view, why didn't PSA become what Alaska Airlines is today? I'm not trying to aim too high. I don't suggest that PSA could have achieved what Southwest did. I think it helps to be centered in the middle of the country to accomplish that. I think Alaska is a more likely model for what could have been PSA's ultimate future. And fair warning, I'm going to engage in speculation. Hopefully, it is informed speculation, but it is speculation nonetheless. And it does not rest on such objective information as the financial perspectives I just showed you. It does rest, though, on what I consider to be a reasonably authoritative source. Gary Cassell joined PSA in 1968 as its Director of Public Relations and was there for most, if not all, of its remaining history. His book, published in 2002, is a fascinating inside look at the airline with, I think, excellent insights into the major personalities that are the reasons it first became what it was and then evolved into what eventually ended. However, if anyone contests what I cite from the book, please let me know during the questions, because I really want to get to the bottom of things, and no source for that can be completely unimpeachable. Now, this question is from the intermediate accounting text that I used this semester at San Diego State. Which do you think is, and I'll list them in a moment, is the answer to the question? And let me poll you again. And remember, we are talking about top management, the C-suite, as we say, the CEO, the CFO, the COO. Raise your hands if you think that the most important function is management control, operational control. Maybe I should let you see all of them, then you'll know what you're choosing from. Planning and decision making, preparation of financial statements, or strategic management. You think strategic management? How many might agree with that, gentlemen? How many think that a different one might be it? Well, which one do you think it is?
I think planning and decision making.
Planning, I got planning and decision making going once. What do I have back there? Also planning and decision making. And you? Also planning and sir? And coming in a strong second. And I think that's a good second choice. The text says it is strategic management for this reason, because they are all critical. And I think planning and decision making is right up there, and it's very closely aligned to strategic management. But strategic management is the only one that can only come from the top. And it's top management's greatest long-term responsibility after the decision making. In fact, I define financial management as the area of management where decisions are based on value, so focused on decisions too. But the decisions should follow from the strategic outlook. All companies compete, and classic marketing theory describes two ways to do that. Either be a cost leader or pursue product differentiation. Give you a moment to read through these. Now, in its heyday, PSA managed to do both. Management guru Michael Porter at Harvard Business School said, that's impossible. I agree, it's probably impossible in the long run. Even Southwest Airlines is no longer a low-cost carrier, but it still bases its marketing on how different it is from other airlines. And you can say the same thing for JetBlue. My contention is that PSA's management abandoned the strategy of differentiation and saw no future, thus sealing the airline's fate. While I hold CEO Paul Barkley as the main perpetrator of this error, I place some of the blame on his predecessors, even all the way back to J. Floyd Andrews. Company behavior reflects company leadership. So let's start with Barkley. Only a few years after he was hired, sharp differences emerged between him and CEO J. Floyd Andrews on a number of issues. At the same time, he instituted a number of actions that contributed positively to the bottom line. But he clearly didn't understand a thing about an airline, or I think any retail-oriented company. Didn't understand how they competed in their market, and Cassell indicates he did not want to. Andrews was hardly perfect. Of that, more in a moment. But as far as Barkley is concerned, Cassell lists a number of telling indicators. I know the description of a control freak when I see it. And an antisocial control freak will only compound the damage. Care to say more? What kind of manager usurps authority as he did in 1973? What authority, I wonder, did he think he had as head of finance to issue such a general directive? His general MO, as described by Cassell, would today be described as the basis for a toxic environment. But let's step back for a moment and look at the 1975 aircraft sale. This may have been a symptom of poor corporate governance instead of something that is beyond the scope of Barclays' grasp for power. No company should allow its major assets to be sold without board approval. So I think there was some missing policy and missing governance there, and I lay that blame at the foot of the board of directors. Now the citings are Cassell's, the bolded characterizations are my own. This man simply did not want to see the world in any other way. And I cannot help but argue that Barclay's unyielding personality prevented him from effective strategic leadership, which requires consultation and collaboration. Specifically, he could not understand the role of product differentiation. I'll elaborate on the mixed record of J. Floyd Andrews in the next slide, but he certainly gave off a vastly more positive impression, and the employees agreed with that. And even though I just hate to read my slides, this time I will. His leadership style included both a high degree of hands-on control and strong employee engagement. He was highly collaborative. He encouraged innovation and cross-functional collaboration. And from the start, he emphasized customer awareness. He was a highly effective marketer, even though, yes, he opposed the smile at first. But he came around. Can't imagine Barclay coming around on anything. And he was people-oriented. He had an open-door policy. He supported unconventional publicity-generating activities and the growth, and this is the key, the growth of the fun-loving, positive company culture that characterized PSA. On the other hand, he wasn't perfect either. I think his biggest problems were sins of omission as contrasted to Barclay's sins of commission. In all candidness, I'm really not convinced that J. Floyd Andrews was prepared and certainly was not trained to run a large and sophisticated organization. Needed more attention to finance. Can you imagine if you were a sports team that if you evaluated your team's proficiency strictly in terms of the win-loss record and nothing else? It takes more than positive cash flow to really understand how well a company is performing and in what area. But more importantly, I really think his failure to institutionalize the culture is what allowed it to ebb away. So the answer to the question of why PSA isn't today what Alaska is, I think is at its root that it was a human and cultural, not a financial or market reason. PSA's management did not take advantage of clearly visible opportunities because they were too distracted by their own idea of what the airline they thought should be. And in fact, they simply gave up and threw in the towel. Sorry to say, We have seen serious strategic failures in many other fine companies too. Carly Fiorina at Hewlett Packard, Jeffrey Immelt at General Electric, Jim McNerney at Boeing, and I'll put it in the corporate realm, George Kliavkoff at the Pac-12 that we're all much too familiar with by now. On the other hand, at least each of them tried. Good leadership is a rare commodity, and there are fewer practitioners of it than there are CEO positions to be filled. Here are three people who, imperfect like all of us, did extraordinary jobs at Southwest. At the left is Lamar Muse, founding president, who really set it on its course. I wish he could have come out here instead. How things might have been different at PSA if there had been leadership like his. On the right, you probably all recognize Herb Kelleher, a legend in his own right, but he wasn't perfect either. Southwest's operational meltdown last December is the direct result of Herb's old school devotion to paper-based systems. Well, you cannot run a 700 plane fleet on paper, pencil, and telephones. Southwest should have spent some of the billions it used to buy back stock on a better operational management computer system. Next to her is Colleen Barrett, his former legal assistant, and for many years, Southwest's vice president of people. She and her team deserve the credit for cementing into place the remarkable company culture that has been a pillar of Southwest's success, and probably the single major difference between it and PSA. I want to end on a positive note. PSA is gone, but its legacy is unquestionable. And let me add a final editorial comment. As much as air travel is less comfortable than it was in the 1960s, it is also much cheaper, safer, and available. If I want a good steak, I'll go to Ruth Chris. But they cannot fly me to New York at a much lower cost than in 1968, in spite of all the inflation since then. And we really have PSA to thank for that. I started this presentation by paraphrasing Mark Antony's opening to his funeral oration for Julius Caesar. I said I came not to praise PSA, but to analyze it. The original goes, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. I hope that I have analyzed PSA, at least to some extent. Let me close then by further adapting the next words that Shakespeare put into Mark Antony's mouth. The decisions that executives make live on after they are gone. Paul Barkley said that PSA needed to become more like United. And Barkley was an honorable man. So were they all honorable men. My name is Dan Goldzbland, and I miss PSA every day. Thank you. And we have a question right off the bat. The question is, they made their bread and butter is up and down the California coast. Why'd they buy 2 TriStars? I think they were going to buy 5. They saw traffic growing, but sometimes I think, and I don't think this is a fair thing to say, but I used to think that PSA never met an airplane salesman it didn't like. But yeah, right, it's not a good idea. Everybody was buying bigger planes though, and as much as I love the 747, what a mistake it was for most airlines. Too friggin' big. And now the focus is more on narrow bodies and frequency of service. He flew on a flight on a TriStar with 4 passengers and 13 crew members. I used to take the 8 p.m. Friday flight from Ontario to San Diego because I was dating a girl in San Diego in college and I didn't have a car yet. And that was a repositioning flight. And well, we had about 5 passengers and 6 crew members on stretch 727. But yeah, I mean, the downturn, the economy went into the tank. It was awful. Yes, sir.
Debt factor in their troubles?
The question was, did debt factor in? If you look at the net income, it was negative the last few years. I think I need a closer examination of that, but I've never heard that they were over indebted. Yes.
What did the result of PSA going to US Air do to US Air?
I don't think it did a dang thing for them any more than buying AirCal or Reno Air did anything for American, which of course is now with US Air. The US Air and American made a habit of buying West Coast airlines and after a year or two, not using them any longer. They had a very difficult time getting out of that thinking. And maybe they weren't so aware of what they were either. Yes. How many of their passengers really were staying overnight somewhere? Yeah, some were. Car rental business made more sense, and I'm not sure it was such a good idea either. The question was, should they have gotten into the hotel business? And what about radio stations? They had radio stations, for Pete's sake. It was a very good move when Barclay moved them into the aircraft leasing business and the fuel business. They made good money from that. Barclay knew what he was doing outside the retail environment. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Okay, for clarification, I'm having trouble with your product differentiation.
Uh-huh.
of PSA. Let me just say, I like the ladies on the flight. I like the attitude of the people, and I like the price. And finally, the frequency of the flights. Where am I missing something here?
No, you've listed more than product differentiation, but the attitude especially was completely different from United.
Right.
Western always had a reputation for good customer service, but they didn't have that kind of fun-loving attitude. Southwest is its inheritor. And I never heard anybody sing funny songs on the PA on PSA as I have on Southwest. But
They lost.
they lost it, and I think as society changed, it made eventual sense to change the uniforms. But Southwest, they don't wear hot pants on any longer, and they still joke and have a fun-loving attitude. But it is very hard to maintain that attitude when you've got a CEO who says, "Be professional, be like United." Comes from the top. Does that answer? I'm not doing a good job of repeating the questions. I'm sorry. Yes.
Just at the perspective, like I've never worked for an airline.
The gentleman was saying that it's the communication from top management that really sets the tone for an organization, and that is what you'll hear everywhere. If Cassell is right, Barclay is clearly to blame for the failure of communication. How many of you have read his book? He actually says that in Barclay's office, whose door was closed all the time, if you wanted to communicate with him, you slid a piece of paper under the door. But in the office, there were paper footprints that if you followed them, led you right out again. It comes from the top. It certainly did at Southwest, from both Lamar Muse and Herb Kelleher. I recommend Lamar Muse's book, even though I don't think he gives enough credit to PSA. You know how they started recruiting stewardesses at Southwest? They published an open letter in the Dallas newspaper to Raquel Welch and said, "Well, we know you can't work for us, but we'd like anyone else like you to do that." It worked. It worked. And they are extremely professional. You can be both professional and fun-loving. And then there's always a line in the middle you aren't sure where to go. For instance, when Bill Schimpf became CEO, he was a pilot and he was very safety-minded. And he put his thumb down on pilot hijinks. Dad, who was the PSA pilot who became the winemaker? Bogle. Yeah. Bogle was the guy who, before many flights, would board the plane from the rear stairs after the passengers were there and would walk up the aisle with a white cane and sunglasses. Yeah. Schimpf said no more of that. Okay, I mean, that's not an unreasonable thing. Sorry to see it go, but
As long as you take the white glasses and wild for the cage air, they're just kidding, folks.
I don't think he did that. Well, Schimpf wanted him on the flight deck during the pre-checks. All right, well, anything else? Any other suggestions? I'm going to look up the debt indebtedness. Yes,
I'm just wondering how the stock will do when the airline is sold.
they got $17 a share. I think the last stock price was about 25. And look, they taught me how to do this at UCLA, but I don't have the data to do it, to figure out how much of that total PSA group stock price is from the airline versus the oil and the aircraft trading. But 17 out of 25, and it had not been making money lately. In spite of being forward-looking, you've got to consider the challenges that were being faced. 17 a share is probably not too bad for the airline part of the company. And of course, the rest of the company went on for many years. So the shareholders got out all right. I'm not sure that we did. Yes, sir.
PSA.
Did whose? I never read anything like they did. Yeah, they did. And they had those paper addresses for a while. I was talking about Braniff's stewardess uniforms. Of course, Braniff they did amazing things with their image, painting the planes. And Mary Wells did an incredible job out at Braniff, the advertising guru who happened to be married to their CEO. The end of the plane, the uniforms. I never flew Braniff. The service was supposed to be incredible. Yeah. And of course, one of our favorite aviation authors, Len Morgan, was a pilot for Braniff. So I don't know that PSA got any inspiration from that. I think they really pretty much, followed their own path. And this is California. It wasn't hard to do that. Anything else? Well, I really thank you for your attention. I hope it's been enlightening. And if anybody wants to get in contact with me, be happy to give you my card, and I'll take any suggestions you have. Thank you very much.